Okay, welcome back to Mr. Lamb Science Corner. We're doing video number 2 of the new chat videos, and we're going to hear today the story, the sad tale of a man named Henry Moseley, and 1887-1915. And Henry Moseley was a very interesting man. He's a physicist, and most of the stuff is going to be about chemistry, but there's a lot of overlap between physics and chemistry, quite frankly, a lot. And so when I taught chemistry, I talked a lot about physics, which is very appropriate because my training is actually in physics. So anyway, Henry Moseley is a man who came up with the atomic number. And I talked a little bit about it in the first video. Atomic number, this is the number of protons. And so it equals number of protons. And protons, if you remember from the first video, has a mass of 1. And it has a charge of +1. Electrons, of course, have a charge of -1 and essentially have a mass of 0. It's not quite 0, but it takes something like pretty close to 1900 electrons to equal the mass of 1 proton. Now, you'd call that pretty close to 0 yourself. So anyway, so he came up with the number of protons, which for some unknown reason is called the Z number. Now, I can't tell you why it's called a Z number. We'll leave that as an exercise for the student. I'm sure the internet will be glad to explain why it's called the Z number, but we have the designation of things is such that if we take a look at hydrogen, for example, this is how we do the atomic notation. The element symbol, hydrogen, this is the, and I'll label these here, this is the mass number, and this is the atomic number. And we use as a generic a letter X designating any particular element, and we call it an A number, which is appropriate because it's atomic, well actually it's mass number, but it's related to the atomic weight, and the Z number. Okay? And so A is the mass number, which is protons plus neutrons. Okay? And I know we're getting into a lot of detail here, but you need to know this because I'm going to be using the isotope symbols a lot during this description. So the mass number, protons plus neutrons. So it's always a whole number. Always a whole number. The atomic weight is not a whole number, as we talked about in the first video. It's an average, and an average very seldom is a whole number. Some of the ones we'll get to elements to where they'll have basically the mass number because they're artificial and they're never found naturally. But natural elements will have an atomic weight, okay, which is usually not a whole number. Okay, and the Z number is the number of protons. Okay, so if we remember this, we'll be doing great. Okay, so feel free to review as needed, or maybe write down some notes or whatever. Okay, now Henry Moseley came up with the concept basically of protons because people knew there was something going on, but they didn't really understand what was going on. And I'll be glad to tell you that later, but atomic theory is a whole different thing. Henry Moseley needs to be mentioned because he was a young man, 18. He died not terribly old, but the reason he died influenced British and then eventually American policy, because he 1915 is a very special year because 1914 war started between Germany and, well, basically all of Europe was involved. And if you look at how the war started, I've read a couple of books on it, and it confuses the heck out of me. It looked like everybody wanted a war, so they hadn't had one for a while, so they had one. But he volunteered, and they put him on the front line. Now, this is a man who came up with the atomic number, the atomic number of protons. Very, very smart man. He was all set to get the Nobel Prize, and then he died. And Nobel, and it was his money, and he said, if you're dead, you can't get the Nobel Prize. And he wanted to do that so they wouldn't go like, and the winner of the Nobel Prize is Archimedes or somebody that had been dead for 2,000 years. So very strict rule. You have to be alive to get the Nobel Prize, at least when they announce it. And there have been a couple of people who, between the announcement and getting it, have died, and they still gave it to them. But when they're considering it, you got to be alive, and he wasn't. And there were people who tried to tell the British government that it really wasn't a bright idea to take somebody that smart and put him as a rifleman. And it sounds very elitist to say that, but the thing is, you want to win the war. And if you got a guy who can do something that help, and we saw this in World War II. We had radar, we had jet engines, we had atomic bombs, we had better torpedoes, we had all kinds of things coming out of the laboratory. And quite frankly, only certain people could do that. And so, mostly because of Henry Moseley, going, and he was fighting in Turkey, in a place called Gallipoli. And if you read about that, be prepared for a lot of bad language, because it was a cluster. There's a lot of people who hate Churchill because of that. And so anyway, Gallipoli was not a nice place. A lot of Australians still hold Churchill responsible for that. Well, he was there, and he was a curious fellow, and he looked up at the wrong time, peeked his head up over the edge of the trench, and the top of his head was blown off by a sniper. So that caused a big scandal, and so World War II come around. If you could be of greater benefit to work in the laboratory than as a rifleman, they put you in the laboratory. And it worked out really well, and we did a lot of scientific development that worked to help us win the war. And since we're considering who we were fighting in World War II, it's a good thing we won. And so my personal thing is that I think in the Vietnam War, they said anybody who goes to college gets a free ride while you're in college. You don't get drafted, and that's taking it, in my opinion, too far, because it didn't matter what you were studying in college, and basically what it did is it caused a lot of division that we still haven't gotten over with yet, because poor people, mostly people of color, went to fight in Vietnam, and richer people, middle class people, white people tended to not, and um, that was, you know, a problem. They did change that towards the end, and they drew draft numbers. So my draft number was number 168. So anyway, that's the story of Henry Moseley. He came up with the atomic number. Could probably have come up with lots of other things, but just a little too curious and got his head blown off, and that's what we know him for. Thank you very much.